Okay, so picking up where we left off in yesterday's lecture, yesterday we looked at kind of the social hierarchies of China in the classical era, and today I want to do kind of the same thing by focusing in on India. And so the first question I want to begin with is, how did Indian social hierarchies emerge? What's their history? Where did they come from? We know that China's largely emerged from Confucian theology and kind of grew through the Han Dynasty. And India's actually dates back all the way to the Indus River Valley time. Now, the word caste itself and the caste system used to kind of describe Indian social hierarchies, the word caste is actually a Portuguese word, right? And we're going to find out later in the course what the Portuguese would have to do with India. But the Portuguese basically arrived in India, around 12 1300 BC or CE, and basically made observations looking at the social dynamics within Indian society and gave it a word that was kind of representing purity of blood, right? That they felt like this was the best way of describing what the Indians themselves were kind of perpetuating, right? And so if we looked at kind of the theories of the emergence of the caste system, um, a lot of historians kind of believe that it evolved rather, from an encounter in the Indus River Valley between lighter-skinned Aryans, which is lighter-skinned northern Indians from the Caucasus region and the Central Asia, and kind of the natives of the southern Indian region, which had much darker skin, right? And so these interactions between light and dark skin kind of gave rise to these natural separations within Indian society. Now, whether or not that's true, we don't really know. It's one theory amongst many, but it can be said with some certainty that the caste system, as an original idea thousands of years ago, definitely grew from an interaction of diverse peoples, right? And how we arranged ourselves, or how Indians arranged themselves according to the different layers of diverse people. And so as these peoples kind of encountered each other and blended and interacted, they developed economic and social differences between them. Certain subgroups tended to be wealthier, more specialized. Certain subgroups tended to be, poorer and work certain jobs. And so by 500 BCE, so 2,500 years ago, there was a pretty clear belief in Indian society that their society was at its heart divided into four great classes, and these classes became known as Varna, right? These four great Varna, four great classes, and that your position in these classes was determined by your birth, meaning the second you came out of your mother, and burst into the world, your position in your class in life was established. And three of the segments were kind of derived from the lighter skinned Aryans. At this point, that had blended so much that there was already a range of lighter skinned colors, but three of these segments were seen as descended from Aryans, and then there was the fourth, known as the Sudras, which are the darker-skinned native peoples, who were, grew in that society to kind of mostly hold very subordinate positions, or, to use a different word, very lowly positions, right? And so as we look at this evolution, right, the Varna theory is another way of kind of expressing how this formed. And the Varna theory is largely based on Hindu belief systems, which we already looked at, right? Hindu belief systems are a major part of the caste system, and, really kind of validate this idea that people hold their position or their class for their entire life, and if they live their life in such a way that they are the best version of that particular class or that particular person, you've earned a great karma, and you would be reborn higher up in the social hierarchy. But this Varna theory specifically is looking at the Hindu religion and saying that the four groups themselves descended from the body of one of the Hindu gods, Purusha. And because these four groups were descended from the body of a god, they really couldn't be changed, right? But the reality is that there was considerable social change in ancient India, not in people moving up and down subgroups, but that the interactions between the different groups was causing each different class to kind of grow and adapt. Now, if we looked at sort of the top part or the top half of the pyramid, you saw the Brahmin and the Kshatriya um, Varnas. And these were basically the Brahmin were the priest class, right? They were the religious. They sat at the top of the Hindu social hierarchy, the caste system. And the Kshatriyas group were basically the ruling class, right? Like, from kings to princes to important government figures and politicians and whatnot. And they were the next level down, right? Compare that with China, where we had the government at the top and then rich landlords down. This was religious people at the top, the Brahmins, with kind of important ruling class people down below. Now, the Vaisya Varna was below them, and they were largely the business class. These were the traders and the merchants. And then, kind of all the way, kind of getting towards the bottom, were the Sudras, which became the peasant farmers. Now, even as these were the four groups descended from the god Purusha, there was this creation of a fifth um, class or a fifth level on the Hindu social hierarchy that basically were known as the untouchables. They were not even a part of the god themselves. They were to be kind of shunned and kept apart. And these were, like I said, the untouchables. And so looking at here, this is what we're talking about. The Kshatriyas called warriors on this, but basically the ruling class. The Vaisyas were the farmers, the merchants, the craftspeople, Sudras, farm workers, etc. Right? And so you can see the top three were descended from the Aryans, the lighter skinned, with the non-Aryans being the bottom. And where did they come from on the god of the god of Purusha? As according to Hindu theology, well, the Brahmins were the mouth of the god, right? And gave utterance to the words and the thoughts of the god Purusha. And the arms, did the god Purusha's bidding, right? They were strong and they executed his will. And the vices, the thighs, they did the work, right? They carried the body and they were important, whereas the Sudras were the feet, the lowest part. But that Varna theory, which is largely derived from Hindu theology, is only one of them. Now let's look at caste according to the opposing theory, which was the Jati theory, right? And the Jati theory said that basically social distinctions really had very little to do with original Hindu belief systems out of the Indus River Valley, which, if you remember, was basically a classless society. And instead, caste emerged from basically social distinctions based on job specialization. There's that agricultural revolution tie-in. And that as job specialization became more entrenched in Indian society, you started to have people who were just sort of looked at as more important, as more elite, and higher up. And so these Jatis were the guilds that people's families would then belong to, right? And so you, as a person who were born into this world, would be born into a family of farmers, or a family of traders, or a family of rulers, or a family of priests, right? And so these Jatis kind of organized themselves, and over time, this idea of social distinction, right, where your importance was driven by where you were socially, blended with this religious idea of the Varna system based in Hinduism, and created what we would consider today to be the full caste system, which has social distinctions blending with religious justification. Right. And so now, if we were to look and zoom in on this pyramid and say, well, if these jatis, if I say merchant class or farmers class, that's a very broad distinction. If you zoom farther in, you would actually see thousands of different jatis that became the primary way that Indians organized themselves, right? And so each of the four great classes, the Varnas, would be divided into kind of these subcastes, these jatis, right? And these jatis, where you fell on that social hierarchy in the caste system, defined your position on this planet, right? And so you lived your life and you did the very best that you could, and you lived your dharma, meaning you lived your lot in life, your role. You lived your dharma and you earned your karma, and then you would die and the cycle would repeat and your soul would evolve. And if you did, lived your dharma and earned your karma, you would rise in the caste system. All right, and so as a way of organizing Indian society, the distinctions that existed between these jatis, right, became so sharp that marriage and even eating together were impossible for anyone outside of your jati, outside of your caste or your subcaste, right? And so you were permitted to kind of interact and engage and marry and socialize with people on your level only. You wouldn't do it below your level, just as people above you wouldn't do it with you, right? And so these castes, these subcastes, each had particular duties and rules and obligations, right? And this was the way you would earn your karma. You do these things according to the best of your ability, right? And so if you were to blend or kind of intermingle outside of your jati and cause kind of the basis of the caste system to start breaking down, you were basically shunned, right? You were breaking the system, right? And you would be ostracized. And so as we talked about, right, so the jati theory was social distinctions based on job specialization that emerged in the agricultural revolution, and this eventually kind of blended and married with this religious interpretation of who we were on this planet, which was the Varna theory, gave us the caste system, which was an incredibly unequal social hierarchy with no social mobility. And the reason why there was no social mobility and such great inequality is because it was supported by these Hindu beliefs of dharma, karma, and rebirth, right? That your birth into your caste was determined by the quality of your previous life, and that if you lived your previous life according to the very best of your ability and you did your dharma and earned your karma, then you would reborn higher up. Just as if you didn't, you would kind of drop, right? And so, if you were reborn in the higher caste and it was seen as your soul, was extra pure and extra good, then that you didn't mess with that, right? You don't argue with that. This person's a rich person because clearly their soul um, is purer than mine, who's a lowly farmer, right? And so, again, you didn't mess with these rules. These social rules were entrenched in Indian society, and messing with them would cause for social shunning, right? And kind of the removal of your place even in society. We already talked about how social mobility was absolutely not a thing. This lies in direct contrast to what we saw in China. Even as it was rare, it was possible. And so now let's take a look at this idea. How did caste impact Indian society, right? And so you look at the top and you look at the bottom, and you obviously see different social classes. The top looks pretty affluent and wealthy, with fine clothing, lighter skinned, whereas the bottom are much more of a laboring class, darker skinned. And so these formalized class divisions were present in all of early Indian empires, right? The Mauryans, the Guptas, we're going to see it in the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals, which are going to come down the line. But at its heart, caste was very local, and it encouraged commitment to your family and encouraged a commitment to your village, which was oftentimes in your village didn't it was a village of your particular caste, of your subcaste, your jati. And so the loyalties that it created were very local. And this was another reason that made empire building extra difficult. We already talked about the enormous diversity, cultural diversity in the Indian subcontinent. We talked about how there's thousands of different languages spoken in India and many different cultural realities. And so that alone made India hard to bond together. But so did the fact that caste encouraged local loyalties, meaning kind of the looking outside that and loyalty to an emperor or to a kingdom that was bigger than your village was harder. And so caste became the way that the Indian state um, broadly organized itself, right? It made sense of Indian society. It created rules that people had to live by. It created order, even as the order was incredibly unfair and incredibly unequal, right? It was a way of organizing society. This is kind of what we get at when we look at social hierarchies. They might be unequal. they might be wrong, they might be racist, they might be, misogynist, but they do provide rules for society. We'll pick up here in part 2.